Hey guys, welcome to Mr. Valentin's YouTube video for The Great Gatsby. Today we're going to just review characters, setting, and some literary terms. A lot of this stuff we've done in class, so none of this should come as a surprise, but this again is only going to review the first couple chapters, not necessarily the plot points, because we've discussed those plot points in details, but you need to know your characters and you need to have a reminder of the setting. So this is great if you didn't manage to come to extra help, or if you'd like some extra help just on the side anyway. So let's begin. Okay, so the first of the three settings is East Egg. We don't need to know too much, but we need to know exactly what it is and who lives there. So first things first, East Egg is what's referred to as old money. All right, so we want to make sure we note that. What does old money mean? Old money means that people have had this wealth in their families or in trust funds or something akin to that for a very long time. Unlike new money, which would be money that we stumbled upon. So characters that would be categorized in the old money format. Really, the only characters that we know that come from East Egg are the Buchanans. All right, which would be both Tom and Daisy. In the text, they describe East Egg as this very elaborate, very hoity-toity kind of area. The text reads, "And so it happened that on a warm, windy evening I drove over to East Egg to see two old friends whom I scarcely knew at all," obviously talking about Tom and Daisy. I see my typo. Done. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected, a cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The lawn started at the beach and ran towards the front door for a quarter of a mile, jumping over sundials and brick walls and burning gardens. Finally, when it reached the house, drifting up to the side in bright vines as though from the momentum of its run, the front was broken by a line of French windows glowing now with reflected gold, and wide open to the warm, windy afternoon, and Tom Buchanan in riding clothes was standing with his legs apart on the front porch. So we see East Egg as this large representation of classic taste. All right, it's not just a house, it's a Georgian colonial mansion. And it's not just a mansion, it overlooks the entire bay. And the lawn is not just a lawn, it has a beach, and it goes for a quarter of a mile. And there's sundials and brick walls and burning gardens. So it's really this kind of elaborate and gorgeous area, which, as you see in the picture, it is this kind of grand and very elegant location. West Egg, on the other hand, is an entirely different beast because it's also rich, but in a very much different way. As I said before, it's associated with what we call new money. These are people who have largely worked and inherited their wealth instantaneously. This is not the kind of wealth that has been handed down to them. A current day example would be someone like Oprah or the founder of Facebook, anybody like that. What we're avoiding are people like the Kennedys and the Roosevelts. Those are people who were born into that money. So this is strictly new money, money that's recently come about. The people who live there are Nick, all right, our narrator, which we'll talk about more. His house is described more as weather-beaten, a little pathetic looking. It says in the text, "The practical thing was to find rooms in the city, but it was a warm season. I had just left the country of wide lawns and friendly trees, so when a young man at the office suggested that we take a house together in a commuting town, it sounded like a great idea. He found the house, a weather-beaten cardboard bungalow, at $80 a month. But at the last minute, the firm ordered him to Washington, and I went out to the country alone." So Nick's house is what they refer to as a bungalow, which is nothing more than a summer home, nothing more than a shack. As you see to your left, that's not what this picture shows. What I'm showing is more of something like Gatsby's mansion. I don't want you to think that Gatsby is unrefined. It's just that he's very showy. All right, so to your left, you'd see something more akin to Gatsby's mansion. It's very elaborate. You'll notice there's fountains in the front. It's got lots of showmanship with steeples, while when we looked at East Egg, it was a little more classy. So there's a certain showmanship to the houses in West Egg. And finally, we come to the Valley of Ashes. In the text, it says about halfway between West Egg and New York, the motor road hastily joins the railroad and runs beside it for a quarter of a mile so as to shrink away from a certain desolate area of land. So that's the first time we hear of the Valley of Ashes, and it's described as desolate. This is the Valley of Ashes, a fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills and grotesque gardens. So we can pick out some clue words to kind of point out what this area looks like. It continues, where ashes take the form of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and finally, with transcendent effort, of men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. So we begin to see some clear descriptions of this place. Occasionally, a line of gray cars rolls along an invisible track and gives out a ghastly creak. So be aware of the Valley of Ashes, and the people who live in the Valley of Ashes we know are the Wilsons. So that's the settings that you need to know. Now we go on to the characters of our story. Ooh, and just one last thing. Of course, we have to be aware of the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. And the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, they kind of stare from above, and they're described as blue and gigantic, and their irises being 1 yard high. That they look out of no face, but just an enormous pair of spectacles. All right, so do know about the billboard. It's pretty important. It seems that it's emphasized throughout the text. So I just want to add that in. All right, Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. Good. The first character we're going to talk about is Nick Carraway. When we go to watch the movie, this is the person who they say looks a lot like Nick Carraway. So here we go. So this is Nick Carraway. In this little review, we're focusing on the characters that are important as of now. Some of these characters might change a little bit. So characters like Tom, who seem initially important, will kind of fade as Gatsby takes over in later chapters. But right now, we're focusing on the characters who seem like the main characters. So Nick Carraway, he was described as our narrator. In class, many of you described him as a bit egotistical, always intelligent, things of that nature. We know that he wants to become a Bond man. Now, that doesn't mean he wants to be James Bond. It means that he wants to work in the Bond business. Alright, so just keep that in mind. That's pretty much all we need to know for now, alright? This test isn't really focusing a ton on all of this information. So, there's just a little bit about Nick Carraway. The next character, alright, is Daisy Buchanan. So far, what we know about Daisy is that she's Nick's cousin. She's described as always whispering, so that you have to kind of lean forward to hear her. At times, she's described as wispy and ethereal. All right. There's a certain airiness to Daisy. All right. We know that she's unhappy in her relationship. She's indicated that. And the way that we definitely know that is the way she talks about her daughter, or lack thereof, really. She doesn't really seem to say too much about her, other than she wishes she was a fool, which is kind of like a horrible thing to say about your child. But she really is just unsatisfied with who she is. So I think we'll see Daisy definitely develop throughout the story. The other third, seemingly a main character at this point in time, alright, is Tom Buchanan. Tom, so far, has been described as hulking, and when we talk about Myrtle, abusive. He's just generally unpleasant. Antagonistic would be a great word to add to the list. Alright. Extremely wealthy, arrogant, pompous. That's Tom Buchanan. So far, secondary characters have not really done too much. So we definitely first want to list Jordan Baker. We know Jordan Baker is a professional golf player. She's described as very slender. And she has interest in Nick on some form. She seems very casual so far. And we don't know too much about her. So I'm going to kind of just leave it at that. Know the big deals about these characters. Don't focus on the minutiae just yet. Later on, we'll look at the details. Obviously, the story is called The Great Gatsby. Unfortunately, we haven't really known much about Gatsby so far. We just know he likes to have large parties. He knows Nick from the war. Jordan Baker described him as an Oxford man. But she doesn't believe him. So there's a certain amount of mysteriousness to him. That's pretty much it. Very suave, very rich. And the only other thing that I would note about him was the kind of strange scene we saw with him reaching out towards that green light, which becomes one of the big symbols. The last character we want to focus on, alright, is Myrtle Wilson. So far as we know, Myrtle Wilson is in an unhappy relationship with George. Just no, unhappy with George. She's described as very voluptuous. They also spend, we go to that scene at the hotel room, and there Myrtle's treated less than stellar by Tom, as he has no problem, quite literally, beating her. So we know Tom is an aggressor in this relationship. So that's pretty much it about Myrtle. As for our tertiary characters, we have George Wilson, Mr. McKee, and Mrs. McKee. What we know about George is that he owns a car shop for repairs. That Myrtle kind of walks all over him. Myrtle describes him as cheap. And while we don't know if that's true, there's a certain air of his cheap qualities. We know that obviously these people who live in the Valley of Ashes are of a lower class. How low remains a little bit of a mystery, but we get the kind of clue that it's not all it's cracked up to be. Mr. McKee, alright, we met at the hotel room. He's described as a very feminine man. And we know he's a photographer. otherwise, we haven't gotten too many details about him either. So there's that. And then finally, Mrs. McKee. Mrs. McKee's the person who uses the very derogatory term against Jewish people. All right, she has an air of low classness to her. She's described as a handsome woman. All right, so we get a little bit of a paradox right there. So those are the characters you should be aware of, along with the setting. And the last bit I want to do is just go over some important literary terms. So, some important literary terms. We've seen most of the obvious literary terms that at this point we've had a foundation for since both 9th and 10th grade, and maybe even earlier than that. So, just some basic literary terms you should be aware of. Alright, obviously a simile, which, as we know, is a comparison using like or as. We should be aware of metaphor, which is a comparison that does not use like or as. We should know the plot's structure so far, and so far we have exposition, which is where we find out the setting and meet the characters. We should add in the inciting incident, which we know is the moment that the plot moves forward. We should know what was formerly we referred to as the rising action, but what we're going to now refer to as the complication, because we want to use more sophisticated vocabulary. And we know the complication are the events leading to the climax. We should know imagery, and imagery is described as visually descriptive or figurative language. We should add in hyperbole, which we know is an exaggeration. And we want to make sure we add in paradox, which I've very simply defined as juxtaposition, but then of course you need to know what juxtaposition is. And juxtaposition is a seemingly absurd or self-contradictory statement or position that, when invested or explained, it features something that's inherently backwards. The best example I can give is something akin to, it was so cold I was sweating, which we know is possible, but it just seems very unlikely. These are the main literary terms that we've emphasized so far. I think the only thing I missed was internal conflict, so we want to add that. Whoops. And we know internal conflict is conflict within a character, conflict within the self, which we haven't seen too much of, but we will see evolve as time goes on. And I I think I also forgot motif. So let me add that in. All right, which is recurring symbols or ideas. And they can also be extensions of themes. So just keep all of that stuff in mind as we progress through the story. Now, on your test, what you'll see are quotes. And on these quotes, you're going to have to identify what the literary terms are. So you have these literary terms all up in front of you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a couple examples. And you're going to, hopefully, guess what literary terms these could be. So let's try an example. So the first quote is, "I love to see you at my table, Nick. You remind me of a rose, an absolute rose. Doesn't he?" She turned to Miss Baker for confirmation. "An absolute rose." So here we have a comparison of Nick to a rose, but it doesn't use like or as. So here we know we have a metaphor. Let's try another. So the next one quote is, "You see, I think everything's terrible anyhow," she went on in a convinced way. "Everybody thinks so, the most advanced people, and I know. I've been everywhere and seen everything and done everything." So what literary term could this be? "You see, I think everything's terrible anyhow," she went on in a convinced way. "Everybody thinks so, the most advanced people, and I know. I've been everywhere and seen everything and done everything." And of course we know that the answer must be hyperbole. Two more examples. "Anyhow, he gives large parties," said Jordan, changing the subject with an urbane distaste for the concrete. "And I like large parties. They're so intimate. At small parties, there isn't any privacy." One more time. "Anyhow, he gives large parties," said Jordan, changing the subject with an urbane distaste for the concrete. "And I like large parties. They're so intimate. At small parties, there isn't any privacy." So here we have an example of a paradox, something that seems backwards or self-conflicting, that somehow at a large party you have more privacy, despite there being more people and bigger crowds. So it just seems kind of backwards in conversation. One more example. The quote reads, "In his blue gardens, men and girls came and went like moths among the whisperings and the champagne and the stars." One more time. "In his blue gardens, men and girls came and went like moths among the whispering and the champagne and the stars." So here we have a comparison, this time very much using like or as. We have the people being compared to moths. All right, girls came and went like moths. All right, and so clearly this literary term is a simile. So there you have it. So do review, all right? Remember to check over your close reading. Make sure you know your characters, your setting, and if you do all that, and hopefully you came to extra help, hopefully you'll be all set for this exam. Any further questions, feel free to contact me at dvalentin@lakelandschools.org. Thank you for listening.